The Batman fans in 1970 witnessed comic book history happening before their eyes, though most of them didn't know it at the time. For many, these were just the new monthly adventures in the extensive catalog of Batman stories, but DC Comics and the creative people in charge of Batman had a better grasp at the significance of these stories. After a series of questionable creative choices in the 1960s, the Batman comics slowly started to recover by the end of the decade, and at the start of the 1970s, DC Comics introduced to the world the definitive version of Batman. It was the beginning of the most exciting time period in the Batman history, when a new generation of talented creators redefined the character of Batman, creating history in one way or another and shaping the future of the character for decades to come. The long and everlasting legacy of Batman can always be traced back to this time period, which unfortunately never got enough credit or the proper recognition that it rightfully deserved. Though the character and legacy of Batman were redefined like never before during this time, it was also largely ignored by the vast majority of comic book readers, who didn't realize the importance of what they were missing until it was too late. After years of declining sales, inconsistent creative teams, and a deteriorating public image, DC Comics turned out the lights on this version of Batman in 1986, 16 years after it began, closing the chapter of his greatest creative highs and devastating commercial lows with one final story. This was the end of an era that will forever be known as the triumph and tragedy of Batman in the Bronze Age of comics. In the final years of the 1960s, the Batman comics suffered a great loss when the Batman TV show was cancelled in 1968, causing the biggest sales drop that the comics had ever experienced. The light-hearted version of the Batman TV show that had once been a cultural phenomenon was reduced to a low-budget animated series called
The Adventures of Batman with Robin Boy Wonder,
which is often considered as the unofficial fourth season of the live-action show, sharing the same cast of characters, bright tone, and similar plots. This 1968 animated show lasted only 1 year before it was also cancelled in 1969, proving that the popularity of the light-hearted version of Batman was completely out of style. In fact, the whole entertainment industry was undergoing major changes in the late 1960s. The science fiction genre of movies and comic books that had been so popular during that decade started to decline once the space race was over after the first moon landing in the summer of 1969. Similarly, the big production companies over in Hollywood were finally free from the censorship and restrictions of the Hays Code, which had been a creative stranglehold in the movie-making industry since the 1930s. The Hays Code disappeared in 1968, allowing Hollywood to create increasingly violent and visually disturbing movies, while also opening the doors to a new golden age of horror. The realistic terrors of movies like Night of the Living Dead introduced the concept of zombies, while popular animated TV shows like Scooby-Doo introduced the concept of horror to children in a harmless and comedic way. The censorship of the Comics Code Authority also started to become more flexible, allowing DC Comics to bring back horror to their comics, with titles like House of Mystery and The Phantom Stranger. Most of these comics were created by new writers and artists, as the older generation of creators either started to retire or they were forced out of the company. In the midst of these changes, a young artist called Neal Adams started illustrating Batman in the Brave and the Bold comics in 1968, becoming the first Batman artist to have grown up reading the comics and the first creator of a new generation of comic book fans turned professionals to work on Batman. As an actual fan of the Batman comics, Neal Adams brought back the horror visual elements of the Golden Age of Batman, while also taking inspiration from the dark and ominous figure of Dracula portrayed by the legendary actor Christopher Lee. Adams was primarily inspired by Lee's dark and menacing presence, and also the elegant quality of his movements that created a unique motion from his long, iconic cape. The Batman of Neal Adams in The Brave and the Bold was completely different from the Batman of the main comics, and it was also far more successful. The Batman editor Julius Schwartz noticed this and started making changes to improve Batman across his titles. First, he adopted the darker tone of the Neal Adams stories, which meant that Batman was no longer allowed to be seen in broad daylight, emphasizing his creature of the night aspect. The supporting character Aunt Harriet was quietly removed from the comics, as she was a painful reminder of the camp days of the TV show. The final big change that Schwartz and his team made to the Batman comics happened at the very end of 1969, when Dick Grayson was sent away to college, ending the partnership of Batman and Robin. With this change, Bruce Wayne abandoned Wayne Manor and the Batcave, relocating his base of operations to the middle of Gotham, at the penthouse of the Wayne Foundation building. DC Comics wanted to remove anything remotely associated with the camp and comedy version of the Batman of the 1960s, allowing them to introduce a darker and more serious version of Batman at the dawn of the new decade. In the months leading up to 1970, the Batman editor Julius Schwartz oversaw these changes, along with his main creative team that consisted of writer Frank Robbins and artists Bob Brown and Irv Novick. All of them were veteran comic book creators who had a hard time trying to figure out the new direction for Batman. Eventually, Schwartz realized the value that the new generation of comic fans turned professionals could bring to the table, hiring Neal Adams as the main Batman artist for his contributions in redefining the visuals of the character. All that was left now was to find a writer that was capable of redefining the character of Batman. Dennis O'Neil was another comic book fan turned professional who had been writing comic books since the mid-1960s. His first approach to Batman came at the peak of the TV show's popularity, when editor Julius Schwartz assigned him to write one Batman story. O'Neil presented a story that didn't follow the style of the TV show, which was mandatory at the time. As a result, the story was shelved and O'Neil continued working on other comics. Nevertheless, the story that O'Neil had presented was quite appealing to editor Julius Schwartz, and once the decision was made to steer away from the TV show's style, Schwartz hired Denny O'Neil as the new Batman writer at the end of 1969. The first Batman story by the new creative team of writer Denny O'Neil and artist Neal Adams was published in Detective Comics number 395, in one of the most historically important Batman publications. Not only was this the first Batman story fully created by the new generation of fans turned professionals, but this was also the most important turning point for Batman, as he was no longer associated with the previous era and officially kickstarted the Bronze Age of Batman as a completely new character. The story, called The Secret of the Waiting Graves, was unlike anything that readers had ever seen before. A true horror story that takes place in a graveyard away from Gotham, where Batman stops a couple of immortal beings, striking as this impossibly dark avenger of the night. Though the Batman of Neal Adams had already proven to be successful, it was ultimately improved by the remarkable new characterization of Batman as this stoic, loner, obsessive vigilante with a never-ending desire for justice and vengeance. Denny O'Neil had also been inspired by the early Golden Age stories, where Batman was portrayed as this dark avenger of the night, and he built upon that concept, understanding the character of Batman better than any other writer since Bill Finger, and creating one of the most memorable stories in the history of Batman, introducing what many consider to be the definitive version of the character. The story was a critical success among Batman fans, who realized that DC Comics had finally found the right direction for Batman. The Caped Crusader was no more, and in its place was the Dark Knight Detective, with a new realistic Batmobile, more in line with the new serious and dark stories. Though some light-hearted comics were published after that initial story, there were very few and far between, as the popularity of horror was on the rise, and the darker stories creeped their way into the Batman comics. Throughout 1970, the character became known as The Batman, both in and out of the stories, which were loaded with a heavy horror atmosphere and featured a frightening-looking Batman in sinister settings like haunted mansions, old castles, and graveyards, with Batman facing supernatural threats like ghosts, witches, and evil mad scientists. It was around this time that the first Batman story written by Denny O'Neil back in the mid-1960s was finally published in Batman number 224. In the wake of this new age of dark stories, the creative team realized that Batman required new enemies, and although they experimented with ideas that didn't have much success, such as the Ten-Eyed Man and a group of circus freaks, there was one character that stood out among the rest. After an initial idea by editor Julius Schwartz, the other Batman writer, Frank Robbins, collaborated with Neal Adams and created Man-Bat, the quintessential horror Batman villain. In Detective Comics number 400, Frank Robbins and Neal Adams presented a story about a scientist who accidentally turned himself into a monstrous human bat, and the character became so popular that it became the most prominent Batman villain of the early 1970s, with a whole saga of stories dedicated to him and his horrific story of tragedy and redemption. Man-Bat is a character that couldn't have existed in the 1960s, as the Comics Code Authority restricted any stories about vampires or werewolves, and Man-Bat is basically a combination of both monsters. DC Comics continued pushing the boundaries of the Comics Code Authority, and shortly after Man-Bat, they introduced another unthinkable concept in the previous decade, an organization of killers called the League of Assassins. The introduction of the League of Assassins was developed by writer Denny O'Neil and editor Julius Schwartz as the first step in the creation of the ultimate Batman villain. Over a series of standalone issues throughout 1970 and 1971, they slowly introduced new characters associated with the League of Assassins, starting with the beautiful and enigmatic Talia, before finally revealing the mastermind behind everything, an immortal megalomaniac called Ra's al Ghul. Julius Schwartz came up with the name Ra's al Ghul. Denny O'Neil developed the character and his motivations, while Neal Adams developed the visuals for the character. In 1971, Ra's al Ghul was introduced in Batman number 232 as this exotic villain that wants Batman to marry his daughter Talia and become the leader of his empire. Ra's al Ghul is a character with many similarities to the villains of the popular James Bond franchise, with Rage controlling a large international criminal network and his daughter Talia acting as Batman's Bond girl. The Ra's al Ghul stories also play out as typical Bond adventures, with Batman traveling around the world to stop the evil plans of Rage and having romantic encounters with Talia. The entire saga of Ra's al Ghul was told in 10 issues of Batman and Detective Comics between 1970 and 1972. The storyline was not published consecutively, instead being interrupted throughout its run with other standalone stories. The original arc of Ra's al Ghul eventually became known as the Saga of the Demon, which was written entirely by Denny O'Neil, with artists Bob Brown and Irv Novick doing most of the art, and Neal Adams working only on the most important chapters. This was the first long storyline ever printed in the Batman comics, and it introduced staples of the Batman mythos, such as Batman's undercover identity of Matches Malone, the Lazarus Pit that grants immortality to Ra's al Ghul, and the iconic climactic battles with Batman and Rage fighting with swords in the desert. The Saga of the Demon represents an evolution in the character of Batman, as it's thanks to Ra's al Ghul that Batman starts fighting for the fate of the world and not just Gotham City. This was also the first time that Batman's romantic side was treated in a believable way, showing layers of complexity in the dynamics of these characters in one of the greatest creative achievements for Batman during the early 1970s. After successfully creating two new iconic villains, DC Comics decided that it was time to bring back one of the classic Batman rogues that was sidelined during the entire Silver Age of comics because the Comics Code frowned at the concept of this character. In the summer of 1971, Two-Face made his comeback to the Batman comics, 17 years after his last appearance. The Bronze Age of comics provided the best opportunity to bring back Two-Face, as his origin story and characterization are a perfect fit for the dark, grotesque, and horrific kind of Batman stories from the Bronze Age. Denny O'Neil and Neal Adams were in charge of bringing back Two-Face with a darker and more sinister characterization and visual style. Though the reintroduction of Two-Face was successful, it was the only exception DC Comics was willing to make about the classic Batman villains. Two-Face had never been associated with the Silver Age shenanigans, unlike the rest of the rogues, whose reputation was tainted and they weren't even considered for a comeback. Instead, DC Comics focused on creating detective stories to provide a bit of diversity from the horror adventures. Many Batman stories of 1971 and 1972 consisted of murder mysteries and clever criminals trying to test Batman's abilities to solve crimes. The most prominent of these enemies was the Spook, a criminal who dressed up as a ghost and challenged Batman with unexplainable criminal activities. The Spook is a character that showcases how the Batman comics started to become mixed up between the horror and detective genres, with clues for the reader to solve the mysteries along with Batman in stories loaded with a dark atmosphere. This concept didn't quite work, and it started to feel as if DC Comics was sleeping after a great start. Soon, they brought back an idea from the Silver Age of comics, when they presented stories about the Super Sons in the world's finest comics. Batman and Superman continued having regular adventures in that series, but in 1973 DC started making stories about the teenage sons of Batman and Superman from a possible future. Though these stories didn't last for a whole year, it was clear that the creators started aiming the comics towards a younger audience once again. This is most likely because in 1972, Batman appeared as a guest character in the new Scooby-Doo movies animated show, once again as the kid-friendly version of Batman.
Yes, Shaggy, we'll all have a snack. Bat milk and cookies for everyone. Bat milk?
This collaboration led to the development of the Super Friends animated series in 1973, where Batman and Robin were part of the superhero team known as the Super Friends. With the dynamic duo back on the spotlight of the mainstream media, DC Comics started using Robin more frequently in the Batman stories, although never as a permanent character because Robin didn't align with the new vision of Batman, and also because Robin played an important role in the Teen Titans comics. Still, the influence of the animated shows was undeniable, because alongside Batman and Robin's return to the small screen in 1972 were the Joker and the Penguin, leading to their eventual comeback to the comics only 1 year later. In 1973, the Joker was brought back in one of the most important Batman stories of the Bronze Age. The classic Joker's Five-Way Revenge was the final Batman collaboration between Denny O'Neil and Neal Adams, and just like they did with Two-Face a couple of years earlier, they reinvented the Joker, returning the character back to his psychotic and murderous ways, similar to his original Golden Age stories. The successful return of the Joker was followed up by the return of the main Rogues Gallery, including the Penguin, Catwoman, Riddler, and the Scarecrow. They were all brought back as darker, more psychologically twisted villains like the Joker and Two-Face, which required a logical explanation. In the Joker's comeback story, it was established that he had escaped from an unnamed mental institution, and it wasn't until 1 year later, in 1974, that Denny O'Neil created Arkham Asylum as the place where all the Batman villains are locked away. Though Denny O'Neil had almost completely re-established the Batman mythos by upgrading all the classic villains and creating new enemies and concepts, the comics were not selling well. One of the reasons was the fact that Neal Adams was moving away from DC Comics, illustrating his last Bronze Age Batman story in Batman number 255, where Batman fights a werewolf. The story was written by Len Wein, another young fan turned professional, and it was yet another horror story, which at this point had become a bit stale. The ending of the Denny O'Neil and Neal Adams era in Batman marked a turning point for the character, as the sales of the Batman comics dropped and DC Comics needed to do something about it. In the final months of 1973, DC reduced the publication schedule and format of Batman and Detective Comics, turning them into bi-monthly series. Each issue contained 100 pages, with only one new story, and the rest of the issue were reprints of old comics. The Batman editor Julius Schwartz was removed from Detective Comics, and Archie Goodwin became the new writer and editor of the series, to save money on that title. Goodwin worked all throughout 1974 on the series, alongside some notable artists like Walt Simonson, Alex Toth, and Jim Aparo, who had become the new Batman artist in the Brave and the Bold comics after Neal Adams left the series in 1970. Jim Aparo quickly became one of the most iconic Batman artists of the 1970s, thanks to his graceful and athletic rendition of The Dark Knight. Unfortunately, no amount of artistry was enough to pull up the declining sales of Detective Comics, as readers just couldn't connect with the Batman of Archie Goodwin, who insisted upon humanizing Batman and focused more on his Bruce Wayne persona, removing the Dark Knight aspect that had become successful at the start of the decade. That's not to say that Archie Goodwin's run in Batman was terrible, but the great moments were rather scarce. Among the few notable things during this run were the introduction of Lieutenant Bullock and the story called Night of the Stalker from Detective Comics number 439, which was not written by Goodwin but rather by a young writer called Steve Englehart. This is one of the greatest Batman stories ever told, but regardless of this, the sales of Detective Comics didn't recover, and after only 1 year the series went back to the old format, with Julius Schwartz returning as editor. By 1974, writer Frank Robbins, the co-creator of Man-Bat and The Spook, had moved away from Batman, while Denny O'Neil started writing only on occasional stories. One of them was the 1974 team-up between Batman and The Shadow, a story that O'Neil dedicated to Bill Finger, the co-creator of Batman who had recently passed away that same year. In 1975, Julius Schwartz started looking for new Batman writers, allowing many young creators to come up with their own unique stories. One of the most notable stories during that time was the Bat Murderer saga, written by Len Wein and illustrated by Jim Aparo. This was a murder mystery where Batman was framed as the killer, turning him into a wanted criminal. Though the Bat Murderer saga was one of the highlights of 1975, Julius Schwartz eventually hired his close friend David Reed as the main Batman writer. David Reed was a veteran writer, having already written Batman in the 1950s and creating the character of Deadshot during those years. In the mid-1970s, Reed's stories were never as exciting or creative as the ones that came before, and although he was a writer capable of telling good detective and mystery stories, his work never felt appropriate for Batman. In many ways, the work of David Reed is unremarkable, and it's a regression to the old days of Batman stories written by people who were not fans of the character. As the sales of Batman continued to drop, DC Comics tried to find ways to revitalize the series, and their first plan of action was to create new comics based on Batman-related characters. In 1975, DC Comics published The Joker, Man-Bat, and Batman Family. The Joker was the first comic book series in history to feature a villain as the main character. Unfortunately, the series never worked, because although the Comics Code Authority had relaxed in previous years, it was still problematic when it came to murderous criminals. The Joker couldn't be portrayed as the sadistic, psychotic killer that fans came to love, and the tone of the series was just too dull to be effective. The series was cancelled only 9 issues after it began. A similar thing happened with the Man-Bat series. Originally created by Marvel writer Jerry Conway and Marvel artist Steve Ditko, the series was cancelled after only 2 issues. This happened because Steve Ditko was the main attraction of that series, as it was the first time that the co-creator of Spider-Man illustrated Batman. However, it would also be the last time, because Ditko left the book immediately after the first issue, forcing DC Comics to simply cancel the series. The only title that actually worked was The Batman Family, a series that consisted of stories featuring Robin and Batgirl, sometimes working solo and other times working together and developing a platonic romance between them. Batman Family quickly became the most popular Batman title, outselling Batman and Detective Comics, which were suffering from inconsistent creative teams and unremarkable stories. The only relevant story of 1976 was published in Detective Comics number 457, where Denny O'Neil created the character of Leslie Thompkins and finally put a name to one of the most iconic and important places in the Batman mythos. The story is called There Is No Hope in Crime Alley, and it's the first story to take a look at what exactly happened to the young Bruce Wayne after his parents were murdered in front of him, in the terrible place that became forever known as Crime Alley. This defining story was one of the last works of Denny O'Neil as a regular Batman writer. In his place, Schwartz hired many young writers to create Batman stories in Detective Comics, introducing questionable new villains like the Black Spider and bringing back forgotten ones like the Signal Man. Meanwhile, Schwartz's close friend David Reed remained as the main writer in Batman, delivering one of his most unique storylines in 1977 as a 4-chapter saga, where all the major Batman villains gathered together for the first time in one story to find out which one of them killed Batman. Though David Reed and Denny O'Neil delivered interesting stories, they didn't do much to help the declining sales of the comics. At this point, DC Comics had been losing the battle against Marvel, which is why in 1977 the company started making some adjustments to recover some of the lost ground. Jeanette Kahn became the new publisher of the company and spearheaded an intense campaign to revitalize sales. It was around this time that the company officially adopted the name of DC Comics with a brand new logo, and they also started hiring writers and artists away from Marvel. One of them was the prolific writer Steve Englehart, who had created great stories for Marvel in recent years. DC Comics wanted Englehart to revitalize the Justice League, the same way he had done with the Avengers, and Englehart, who was considering retiring from comics, agreed to do it, but only under one condition. He also wanted to write Batman. The 1974 story Night of the Stalker was the only work that Steve Englehart had done for DC Comics, and being one of the greatest Batman stories of the Bronze Age, it's no surprise that Englehart wanted to write more Batman. In the early months of 1977, Steve Englehart started his Batman run in issue number 469 of Detective Comics, which lasted for 8 consecutive issues, becoming the first long Batman storyline published without interruptions and focused on continuity, which created a satisfying reading experience. Steve Englehart enjoyed a lot of creative freedom, and using all the experience from his time on Marvel, he created a Batman story for the ages. Englehart's vision of Batman was crystal clear, showcasing a healthy balance between the dark and obsessive Avenger of the Night and his normal life as billionaire playboy Bruce Wayne. This was the first storyline to showcase Bruce as an actual adult, with serious problems and also an active romantic and sexual life. Englehart introduced a new romantic interest for Bruce called Silver St. Cloud, making their relationship believable, mature, and also doomed to fail, something that has become a staple for the character ever since. He also created new villains like the chemically induced Dr. Phosphorus and the evil political crime lord Rupert Thorne, while also bringing back forgotten villains from the Golden Age, like Hugo Strange and Deadshot, updating them for the new generation as believable versions of themselves. The storyline also showcased a more mature and adult version of Robin and a ruthless new characterization for the Penguin. But perhaps the greatest achievement of the saga was that it perfected the character of the Joker. If the early Joker stories of the Bronze Age had brought back the psychotic killer version of the character, Steve Englehart completed the transformation, adding to the character a burst of chaotic energy and a sharp mind for twisted crimes that forever shaped the unpredictable nature of the Joker, with classic tales such as The Joker Fish and The Sign of the Joker. Though Steve Englehart is largely responsible for coming up with such a successful storyline, it was ultimately elevated to masterpiece levels thanks to the art. The first couple of issues were illustrated by the legendary Walt Simonson, before the artistic duties were passed on to Marshall Rogers and Terry Austin, who were the perfect combination to create a darker take on Batman, with sharper experimental visuals and a cinematic approach to comic book art unlike anything that had come before in the Batman comics. The story was incredibly well received among the Batman readers and the professionals of the comic book industry, hailing it as the definitive version of Batman of all time. The storyline was retroactively called Strange Apparitions because of the central plot about the death and ghostly resurrection of Hugo Strange. Though Strange Apparitions was without a doubt the greatest creative achievement in the Batman comics since the early 1970s, it still made little to no difference at all to help the failing sales of Detective Comics. Part of the reason for this failure was the lack of advertisement for the storyline, as well as a general disinterest in Batman among an increasingly maturing mainstream audience, who kept perceiving Batman as a character made for kids, thanks in part to his constant presence in the mainstream animated series of the late 1970s. By 1979, the sales of Detective Comics reached historically low records, which caused DC Comics to consider the cancellation of the series. However, writer and editor Paul Levitz convinced the higher-ups to keep the flagship title of the company and offered a temporary solution to this problem. Instead of cancelling Detective Comics, DC cancelled Batman Family, the most popular Batman title. The idea was to take all the stories featured in Batman Family and put them in Detective Comics, boosting the sales of the title and keeping it alive as the decade was coming to an end. The man responsible for saving Detective Comics, Paul Levitz, soon became the main editor of the Batman comics, when Julius Schwartz decided to focus his attention on the more successful Superman comics and moved away from Batman after 15 years. As the new Batman editor, Paul Levitz wanted to streamline the history of the character and establish one definitive continuity for Batman. For this purpose, Paul Levitz killed the Golden Age version of Batman in 1979. Outside of the main Batman comics, a whole group of writers and artists expanded the story of the Earth 2 Batman in the late 1970s. This version of Batman was retired. He had married Selina Kyle and they had a daughter called Helena Wayne, who became the first Huntress, following her father's heroic footsteps. As interesting as those stories were, they were never featured in the main Batman comics, and as part of the efforts of unifying the Batman continuity to the main titles, they closed the book on the Batman of Earth 2 in order to establish the Batman of Earth 1 as the one and only Batman. Paul Levitz then hired Len Wein as the main Batman writer, who was very much influenced by the previous success of Steve Englehart and followed that same style. For instance, Len Wein created a new version of Clayface, updated for the new generation as a tragic character who could melt people with his touch. He also kept the focus on the personal life of Bruce Wayne and created Lucius Fox as the man who runs his business. And to keep the romantic side of Batman alive, Len Wein developed a lengthy subplot about Batman trying to make things work with a reformed Catwoman. Len Wein also brought back a number of forgotten villains, including Mr. Freeze, Catman, Blockbuster, the Gentleman Ghost, Calendar Man, Crazy Quilt, Kite Man, and he created the arsonist called Firebug. Finally, Paul Levitz and Len Wein created the ultimate origin story of Batman, which was published in the first Batman miniseries called The Untold Legend of the Batman, illustrated by John Byrne and Jim Aparo. The series successfully streamlined the continuity of Batman and became the most complete retelling of Batman's origin ever told. Meanwhile, Detective Comics was still in need of attention, so Paul Levitz hired Denny O'Neil once again to write Batman in Detective Comics, along with artist Don Newton. O'Neil and Newton collaborated on a number of stories, in which they created the Crazy Max Zeus, and they also started a new saga of Ra's al Ghul and the League of Assassins, in which they killed the original Batwoman, as part of the efforts to streamline the Batman continuity. Eventually, Denny O'Neil wrote his last Batman story of the Bronze Age in issue number 21 of the DC Special Series in 1981, where he collaborated with a young artist called Frank Miller on his first work on Batman. In 1981, and more than a decade since he started working on Batman, Denny O'Neil left DC Comics and went on to work for Marvel. Around the same time, Len Wein became busy writing the first intercompany crossover featuring Batman, pitting the Dark Knight against the Hulk in the final issue of the DC Special Series. With Denny O'Neil and Len Wein both out of the picture, editor Paul Levitz started looking for new Batman writers, eventually hiring Jerry Conway as the writer for Detective Comics and Marv Wolfman for Batman. Wolfman's run in Batman was very short-lived, as in little over a year he was removed from the series, after writing only one major storyline involving Ra's al Ghul, Talia, and an increasingly disgruntled Robin. What happened was that in 1981, longtime artist and editor Dick Giordano became the new Batman editor, replacing Paul Levitz. As the new editor, Giordano brought along with him new ideas to try to revitalize Batman. One of these ideas was to have just one main Batman writer for both Batman and Detective Comics, in order to tell stories with connected plotlines that crossed over between both titles. The idea was to establish a more solid sense of continuity, but Giordano also hoped that the popularity of the Batman title would boost the lacking sales of Detective Comics, which was a short-sighted plan that backfired almost immediately. One of the main reasons for that is that Giordano hired two different artists for both titles. While Don Newton remained as the main artist in Detective Comics, Gene Colan became the new artist in Batman, and although both of them were tremendous artists in their own rights, their style couldn't have been more different from each other. The idea of both titles sharing the same plots and continuity didn't even have a chance when, at the start of it all, the artists on both series had completely different styles. With this baffling decision, the task of saving Batman fell upon the new Batman writer. Jerry Conway had already written multiple Batman stories in the past, but in 1981 he faced his biggest challenge when he was chosen to lead the Batman stories into the new era. Jerry Conway's run in Batman established an engrossing continuity, with interesting plots that borrowed many of the themes, concepts, and ideas established by Steve Englehart's masterpiece from a few years back. Gerry Conway not only expanded the storyline of Hugo Strange and Rupert Thorne from Strange Apparitions, but he also brought back a number of forgotten Golden Age characters, just like what Englehart had done in that story. Characters like Dr. Death, the Mad Monk, and Vicky Vale all made a comeback, though they failed to make any lasting impression. In 1982, only 1 year after his run began, Gerry Conway made a very important change to the Batman comics, when, after an initial idea by editor Dick Giordano, he finally brought back Wayne Manor and the Batcave, 13 years after they were abandoned. In the story, Bruce Wayne steps down from his duties at the Wayne Foundation in order to go back to his old base of operations, a change that was considered necessary because of the iconic status of Wayne Manor and the Batcave on the mainstream media. In fact, the dynamic duo remained popular thanks to their constant presence in the Super Friends animated series, which convinced DC Comics that Batman needed Robin to recover the poor sales of the comics. In 1982, Len Wein became the new Batman editor and started the mission of getting Robin back on the Batman comics. This created a conflict, because at this point, Robin had been appearing as the leader of the new Teen Titans after going through years of character development, to the point where nobody was interested in watching Dick Grayson going back to the role of junior sidekick. Marv Wolfman, the writer of the new Teen Titans, came up with a solution. The Batman comics could have their own Robin, as long as he got to keep Dick Grayson. The deal was made, and Marv Wolfman was able to create Nightwing, leaving the mantle of Robin free for a completely new character. Like these, Gerry Conway created Jason Todd as the character that would eventually become Robin, and introduced him in 1983 in a storyline that involved the newest and most dangerous enemy for Batman, a massive brute with a skin condition called Killer Croc. By all accounts, the introduction of Jason Todd had been successful, except for the fact that the entire origin story and background of the character was identical to that of Dick Grayson. For all intents and purposes, Jason Todd was a clone of Dick Grayson, except for the fact that he was a redhead. This controversial storyline was the last big contribution by Gerry Conway to the Batman mythos, as he was immediately replaced as the main Batman writer by Doug Moench, a writer who had only worked on Batman in the World's Finest comics along with Superman a few years prior. However, Moench was the co-creator of the Marvel character known as Moon Knight, who was in many ways similar to Batman, making him the perfect choice to lead Batman into what would become the final years of the Bronze Age. In 1983, editor Len Wein made a big change when he cancelled the classic Brave and the Bold series, which saw Batman teaming up with almost everyone in the DC universe. Though the series was one of the most popular titles, consistently outselling the main Batman comics, it was cancelled in order to create a new title called Batman and the Outsiders. Around this time, comic books featuring teams of young heroes like the new Teen Titans and the X-Men were selling consistently well, so DC created another team of young heroes with Batman, working as their leader. The series was created by writer Mike Barr and artist Jim Aparo, both of whom had been the main creative team at the end of the Brave and the Bold series. Batman was used to promote the Outsiders as a group of new and unknown characters, and although the series was quite successful, the same success couldn't be replicated in the main Batman comics, because the new Robin represented a new problem. As he began writing Batman, Doug Moench faced a terrible challenge. He was in charge of actually turning Jason Todd into Robin, which was a logistical nightmare. Because of the licensing deals between DC Comics and the companies that made merchandise, animated shows, and other products based on the comics, DC just couldn't change the appearance of Robin. Since Jason Todd had been created as a redhead, Doug Moench had to find a way to transform that character into an even greater carbon copy of Dick Grayson. Eventually, and after a really convoluted storyline where Jason Todd dyes his hair black, the new Robin was introduced in Batman number 366, and over the course of the following 3 years, Doug Moench developed Jason Todd as a likable character, with his own traits, motivations, and personality, which unfortunately is something that's always forgotten about in the history of the character. Doug Moench was quite possibly the most consistent writer in the entire Bronze Age of Batman, writing the character for 3 consecutive years and providing the Batman comics with their own and unique sense of identity. Doug Moench was a writer who enjoyed exploring dark and esoteric topics, and who loved the strange and bizarre characters, providing the supporting cast and villains of his stories with as much personality and characterization as the main heroes themselves. It was Doug Moench who established Harvey Bullock as a supporting character for the GCPD, and one of his greatest creations during this time was the crime lord known as Black Mask, co-created with artist Tom Mandrake. Though Doug Moench used all of the classic villains, his most distinctive contribution to the Batman of that era was the creation of Nocturna, a woman whose real name is Natalia Knight and who started out as a criminal, but eventually became a supporting character to the Batman family. Nocturna's most defining characteristic was her white skin, which was the result of a freak accident. Nevertheless, Doug Moench provided Nocturna with a great deal of mystique, elegance and beauty, turning her into the next romantic interest for Batman. Nocturna quickly became the centerpiece of Doug Moench's run in Batman, and although he showed a great understanding of the Dark Knight, creating some of the most engaging stories of that period, focusing on the continuity and the mysterious side of the character, the sales of the Batman comics didn't improve at all. This could probably be the result of the unfortunate passing of artist Don Newton in 1984, which left the Batman comics without a consistent visual style. The artist that came afterwards couldn't capture the essence of Batman, and in terms of characterization, Batman slowly started to become a relatable character, an easygoing authority figure and, most importantly, a family man, taking great amount of care of his new adopted son Jason Todd and dealing with business and romantic matters both as Bruce Wayne and Batman. As consistent and interesting as this run was, this was not the version of Batman that the people fell in love with in the early 1970s, and the popularity of the character decreased dramatically, forcing DC Comics to take extreme measures when in 1985 they started closing the chapters of many Batman-related comics. First, Batman and the Outsiders was rebranded as Adventures of the Outsiders when Batman was removed from the series. Around the same time, DC Comics cancelled World's Finest Comics, the classic series where Batman and Superman had shared adventures for more than 3 decades. The characterization of both heroes had become noticeably divergent, to the point where the creative teams of that series found it nearly impossible to keep writing the stories with both characters as friends, because they had evolved to the point that they couldn't realistically get along anymore. There was a collective and unconscious need, an unspoken desire, for a darker interpretation of Batman. This was also reflected in the mainstream media, when in 1985 the Super Friends animated show released the episode called The Fear, the darkest episode of that series, showcasing the tragic origin story of Batman. This was the first time that the murder of the Waynes was ever seen on the screen, introducing the dark side of Batman to the mainstream audiences for the first time ever. The writer of that episode was Alan Burnett, who drew a lot of inspiration from Batman's origin story from the comics written by Bill Finger and Denny O'Neil. Years later, Alan Burnett would become instrumental in the success of Batman the Animated Series. The increasing interest in the dark side of Batman came to a head in 1986, when Frank Miller created The Dark Knight Returns, the first Batman graphic novel and the first Batman story published without the seal of approval from the Comics Code Authority since 1954. The Dark Knight Returns provided audiences with the mature, dark and gritty version of Batman that they had been waiting for, and the publication of this book sent literal shockwaves throughout the comic book industry, setting the stage for a new, darker era in the history of Batman. It wasn't long after the success of The Dark Knight Returns that DC Comics decided that it was time to close the book on the Batman of the Bronze Age. By 1986, DC Comics had completed the massive multiverse-shattering event called Crisis on Infinite Earths. The purpose of this colossal storytelling project was to streamline the entire DC universe into one single continuity, free from the shackles of the extensive and sometimes confusing past. This gave DC Comics the perfect opportunity to start over with all of their major characters and present new versions for a new generation of readers. In the early months of 1986, editor Len Wein and writer Doug Moench realized that their days on Batman were numbered and that the Batman of the Bronze Age was living on borrowed time. Their final Batman comic was scheduled for the summer of 1986 in issue number 400 of Batman, and knowing that this was going to be their final curtain call, they decided to end the legacy of the Batman of the Bronze Age under their own terms. Detective Comics number 566 worked as the prelude to the final Batman story of the Bronze Age, published in Batman number 400 as a special anniversary issue, featuring some of the greatest names in the comic book industry. The story was a great editorial undertaking, coordinating more than 20 legendary artists that shaped the Bronze Age of comics in one way or another. Len Wein and Doug Moench knew that this was going to be a historical event, and the pressure to deliver a great story that encapsulated the previous 16 years of history was a tremendous responsibility. In order to mark the importance of this issue, Len Wein got famous horror writer Stephen King to write a special introduction for the story, a gesture that was quite fitting, considering it was horror that had kickstarted the Bronze Age of Batman. And with the words of the most notable horror writer on the planet calling Batman his favorite character, the final Batman story of the Bronze Age began. What followed were 60 pages of non-stop action, featuring the most recognizable characters and concepts that defined the Batman mythos during the last 16 years. A story where a massive breakout from Arkham Asylum releases the most iconic villains of the Bronze Age, and has them working together to create the ultimate challenge for Batman, who is assisted by all the friends and allies that he made during this era. Batman and his allies overcome each and every one of their most iconic villains until they finally confront Ra's al Ghul, the evil mastermind that defined the Bronze Age of Batman, and the perfect final villain for this epic gauntlet. Naturally, Batman and his allies came out victorious. But this time, it was different. As Batman and his friends gathered in the Batcave to celebrate the biggest victory in the history of Batman, the Dark Knight wanders off into the darkest corners of the Batcave and stands there surrounded by bats, in acceptance of his ultimate fate. The captions of this moment describe the ending of this Batman as a chance to start again, finally revealing why the story is called Resurrection Night. The lights finally go out on this version of Batman, and the Dark Knight detective leaves the stage with 4 final words. Hello again. Beware forever. The story was a fitting tribute to what the many talented Batman creators cultivated and achieved between 1970 and 1986, when they discovered the best version of Batman and reached the maximum potential of the character with influential, everlasting, and unforgettable stories. DC Comics continued publishing Batman stories after this event, although following a new direction that allowed Batman to become the most popular character in comics, to the point where we've become so used to having so much Batman content in recent years that it's hard to imagine a time when that wasn't the case. At the time of its publication, nobody really understood the importance of Batman number 400. To those living in the moment, this was just an anniversary issue instead of the anniversary issue. It didn't quite feel like the end of an era, but it was. This was the perfect final chapter for a version of Batman that began in 1970, coming out of the lighter interpretation of the 1960s that almost killed Batman, and which was saved by a whole new generation of writers and artists who defined the character with incredible upgrades and allowed him to achieve renewed levels of success among the most committed Batman fans. Though this version of Batman inspired generations of Batman fans and future creators, the appreciation for this time period came decades later. The stories that made history and cemented the legacy of Batman as one of the most important comic book characters were largely ignored at the time of their publication, encapsulating why this is the triumph and tragedy of Batman in the Bronze Age of comics.